Well, thank you very much. So I wanted to, well, maybe first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak here today. I guess this invitation is related to a paper I wrote 1 year ago called On Climate Rent, and so I'm taking up the issue of rents in environmental markets. But what I wanted to do now was a bit experimental, not in a weird sense, but I'm not entirely sure what my argument is. So you let me know at the end if it makes sense. Eric Swingado asked us yesterday to declare our political affiliations, whether we're communists or socialists. So I would describe myself as a Keynesian social democrat, but still or a socialist if you want, and trying to think in terms of, okay, we have plenty of critiques of carbon markets, biodiversity offset markets, and so on and so forth. But what can we do, or what can we think in terms of alternative social arrangements? I'm not speaking here about all the struggles and resistance that have been documented amongst different contributions. I'm speaking here in a much more institutional, and that's why I said social democratic manner. So maybe not everybody will be pleased with that, but I'm taking my chance. I would frame it in terms of André Gortz's non-reformist reforms. What kinds of reforms can we think that arise from the existing power structure, the existing state, the existing power relations, but that build in mechanisms that point beyond capitalist social relations? And so my contribution also draws on the inspiration of James O'Connor's Natural Causes, his theory of the second contradiction of capitalism, of capital. And it somehow relates to what Alex said this morning about trying to think about how the state is an important agent and also an agent maybe for change. I'm quoting O'Connor here, quote, "In any case, it is clear that environmental destruction cannot be laid at the door of capital alone. The state is deeply implicated in the crisis of nature. The same state, under the democratic control of civil society, can be the basis for the reconstruction of nature and our relationships to nature." And so, how can we think in terms of using the states to advance an alternative economic organizations, starting from the questions of carbon offsets, biodiversity offsets, and all these other weird so-called commodities, but that I would argue are not in fact commodities. And here, maybe I need to say a few words on what greenhouse gases emissions rights that are traded are as entities. I've argued that they are not commodities because although they assume the commodity form in a capitalist economy in the sense that they have an exchange value, so they have a price, they have a use value, they are necessary for producer to be allowed to produce, but they are not produced through the expenditure of socially necessary labor time, so they have no value in this sense. So they are what was called by Karl Polanyi and others pseudo-commodities. And I would argue that they are best conceptualized under the notion of rent. They are rent in the sense that they constitute a necessary condition of production, so it's necessary for businesses to own greenhouse gases emission allowances in order to produce, at least in the polities in which you have a regulation which forces you to own these emission rights, but they are an impediment to production. And thus the money that is spent acquiring these emission rights is not, in fact, the basis for the creation of an accumulation strategy, as has been argued by some authors, but basically a form of rent which is imposed by the state. And so they are thus, these environmental rents, they are a draw on surplus value, and they are a form of redistribution of surplus value across different types of capitals, across different sectors, and of course across different countries. And the question then arises, well, if greenhouse gases emission rights are a rent, how do you explain that specific sectors of the economy have supported their introduction? How do you explain that the capitalist state does indeed impose these conditions on production? Here I cannot go into the details, but I would argue that this has to do with the deep contradiction under capitalist social relations between accumulation and reproduction. Reproduction in two different senses, in the sense first of social reproduction, so reproducing the environment in which we live, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and so on and so forth. This was already discussed many times in these last 2 days. But this is also, it touches about the question of the reproduction of the conditions of production, in the sense that environmental degradation, to some degree, returns as a second contradiction of capitalism in O'Connor's discussion in terms of costs, additional costs of production. And Jason Moore has taken up this line of argument in his recent book, which I think is quite interesting. So the point is that because of this contradiction, at some stage the state has to intervene to put on some sort of limitation to the destruction of the natural environment. And these sorts of limitations are very problematic under capitalism. Why? Because it means that the state, which acts in this manner as the executive committee to manage the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, end of quote, somehow has to politicize production, in the sense that it has to say, well, we need to put a cap on production on certain types of activities, we need to put a cap of production on certain companies, and the question then arises, how is this limitation distributed across the economy? And this would open an extremely politicized discussion about which sectors should be promoted, which companies should be promoted, which regions should be promoted, which entities should receive more allowances than others. And hence, the market mechanism allows for a depoliticization of these environmental regulations, in the sense that the capitalist state does not need to make explicit political choices about different types of production, precisely because the different agents under the law of value have basically expressed their different ability to pay in order to acquire these rights. So in this sense, market mechanisms for environmental protection rules allow for a depoliticization of the regulations, and it allows investors to be free, and here I quote not Keynes but Hayek, the liberty to decide what is produced, by whom, and for whom. So this is the basic argument about depoliticization and carbon markets. My question was then, does it need to be so? Could we imagine an alternative institutional arrangements in order to distribute emission rights, in order to distribute pollution rights, in a way which politicizes precisely production, in a way in which the state would need to make an explicit political choice on which entities receive additional rights to emit, additional rights to pollute, additional rights to draw on nature, and this is not left to a purely market-based mechanism. So could we make some sort of case for a democratic planning of allocation of these emission rights? So this may sound hopelessly socialistic or social democratic, but my point is that, well, in some countries, and here I will be talking a bit more about Switzerland, which is the case I know best, such a mechanism does exist in a fairly similar domain, which is land use planning. Land use planning is also about allocating not emission rights, but development rights. And these development rights are allocated, already. It's a shame. I was just barely starting. Well, I will cut all the Marxist theory. And these allocation rights basically are decided at the municipality level. So city councils that are democratically elected and accountable make explicit decision choices about allowing specific buildings to be built on specific plots of land. So this is a very strong mechanism for socializing the production of space, and it's a very strong mechanism for planning some sort of development. And so my argument, and here I cut on many parts of this argument, but it's summarized in some ways here. What is important in land development rights is that they separate the ownership of land from rights to build on that land. So there is a separation here. And I've tried to summarize some of these differences with greenhouse gas emissions rights. The resource can be in private hands, so you can have private ownership of land, but it does not mean that you're allowed to do whatever you please with your land. You are still subject to land use right regulations. So the use rights, they are tied to a specific piece of land. They are concrete in this sense, whereas greenhouse emission gases are abstract. And they are not, the land use rights, they are not transferable, at least unless you don't transfer the piece of land. So if you sell your land, the development rights go with that piece of land. But you cannot sell the development rights in the absence of a selling of the land. Whereas, of course, greenhouse gases emission rights are transferable, they are marketable, and the argument is that, well, we have a market-based type of allocation in the case of greenhouse gases rights, whereas you have a forum-based, to use a distinction made by John Helster, a deliberative sort of planning on the allocation of land use rights. And so my argument would be, well, can we imagine to forumize the distribution of greenhouse gases emission rights? What would it mean to have local or regional institutions that would be tasked with the distribution of greenhouse gases emission rights that are not market-based? So different competing units of production would need to ask for permits. There would be a total amount of permits that can be distributed, and so you would have a public entity which would have to make allocation decisions based on its evaluation of the different needs. So it wouldn't be anymore the market, the ability to pay that would distribute these emission rights, but it would be based on some sort of democratic, deliberative type of institution. I can say a bit more about this, but you get the general idea. Now, to tell you the truth, what we're witnessing, and I'll be finishing on that, is unfortunately the opposite. And we are not currently into broader socialization and democratization of the allocation of greenhouse gases emission rights, but what we're seeing, at least in the case of Switzerland, is the increasing marketization of land use rights. Switzerland has passed a very progressive law 3 years ago by referendum. We do vote a lot, about 3 times a year in the European Union. Anyway, and this very progressive law put a cap on the total amount of land that can be developed in the country. And now the translation of this law at the local level has proved extremely tricky, because basically it created a grandfathering situation in which cities that had over-allocated land development rights have an excess of rights, and those that had been rational in the use of land use rights have a deficit. And we are seeing a creeping marketization of land use rights. I should finish. So anyway, things are getting worse and worse. Thank you for your attention.
Clarification. Sorry, I will have to leave it too, so I would like to make my comments on these plans. So thank you very much. I can see theoretically your point, and I think it's a good point. But what I was thinking while you were talking was, all we have heard in this workshop in the past 2 days is about mega projects, extractivism going on with explicit, in a mechanism of not market allocation, but state and public authorities allocation. So I was wondering what it really makes a difference.
Thank you. Not as such, but it would create the possibility that a difference exists. And so we need to distinguish between the state and how social movements, political forces, can use leverages within the state and put it for more democratic purposes. I think if you, again, take a look at land use rights politics, you can see that there is a lot of capture by vested interests, developers, growth coalitions in cities. That's true. But at the same time, if you have a committed green, social democratic local administration, it does make a difference in the type of city development that you can see. So it's not a magical solution, but I raise the issue because I think that we need to be able to think about alternatives, even if we don't yet have the forces to put in place alternatives. We need to have an alternative discourse that we can come towards to the hegemonic common sense.
So we make sure that the parties stay to the round table in the end. Morgan Robertson.
Thank you. This is going to pick right up where Romain left off, hopefully. And as well as touching on Alex's point about the sort of turning our routine contact with the state against the form of social relations being imposed on us. I'm going to talk about DEFRA offsetting biodiversity pilot and offsetting eventually in this talk, but I'm kind of leaning on the fact that Elia has already introduced it very well as neoliberalism, and so I'm going to kind of dive into the more granular aspect of it. I was struck by two moments at the opening of the conference. One was Eric's contrast between what he called the, quote, everyday rituals of policy and politics. And the other was Nuria's dilemma about whether to choose sort of 5% or 7% in that sort of moment of bureaucratic feeling that this is the death of politics or the absence of politics, this is a non-political moment. I think, and with respect to the validity of her experience, that moment appears non-political where we accept that measure and value is non-political, and the invitation to do so is always very strong and almost overwhelming. So it's my purpose today to convince you to remember the politics of everyday measure. So I've written a lot from a Marxist perspective about the way that neoliberalism worked on nature through wetland banking. But I also worked for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 3 years, writing the regulations governing wetland banking. We should demonstrate how an offset credit is or is not a commodity, and therefore subject to the capitalist laws of motion. But we should also get into the gears of policy itself and see what it can and can't do. I think this is right in line with Roman's point. So in June 2014, I was invited to speak both at the Nature Not for Sale conference organized by Hannah Moa and the No Net Loss and Beyond conference, at which Hannah's conference was organized in protest too, and at which I was invited by Carrie Tenkate to debate Hannah over biodiversity offsets on the pro side. So file under be careful what you ask for. I gamely and rather stupidly accepted, and I'm sure sort of let everybody down in the process, but I feel a responsibility as a joint critic/bureaucrat to try and say the same thing to both groups. And my thesis all along is that we don't know where this is going. I think if we do, as Gramsci famously said, that kind of knowledge comes very cheaply. It's a mistake to look at something like wetland banking or biodiversity offsets as a coherent project at the most granular scales where policy implementation happens. And this makes knowing the inner workings well more important, I think. To be blunt, it puts you in a position where if you want to fix it, you can fix it. If you want to break it, you can break it. And one of the ways you fix or break the valuation of nature in offsets policy is with multipliers. So today I want to talk about multipliers. Many of you know how offsets markets work in carbon and other elements of the environment. You sort of emit 1 ton of carbon, or you fill 1 acre of wetland or hectare, and you might have to purchase 3 tons, or purchase 6 acres or hectares of wetlands to compensate for. By what principle of valuation or ecology do we get this multiplier of 3 or 6? So if you're taking a kind of a high-level external critique, you're not necessarily interested in the answer to that question. It kind of doesn't matter. All you really need to know is that it's arrived at in kind of an ad hoc and not particularly well-defended way, and it's part of either a rent mechanism or a price mechanism, and it's to be seen through. But I really want to know how they agreed to multiply the offset requirements for woodland impacts, let's say, by a factor of 3 instead of by a factor of 20, right? Why is an acre of standing woodland worth 3 acres of compensation? Because if you want to halt woodland impacts in their tracks, use a multiplier of 20. And the arguments to do so are all inside the offsets debate. It's not an external critique. It's inside. The mechanism and the people at the table to argue that are all already there. So it turns out that the use of multipliers is a widespread and accepted way to introduce kind of whatever you want into the valuation of nature. It's an extraordinarily undisciplined set of sort of granular technologies. It is, in some important senses, an open field with the metric that demonstrates how much compensation you need to provide, which DEFRA published in 2012. DEFRA has produced a kind of a box where the knobs that you can fiddle with spit out the value of nature, and there's no mechanism to discipline the value output to ensure that it's sort of functional capitalist value form. And that, I think, is the naivete of DEFRA. I mean, believing that if you release a metric for measuring the value of nature into the wild, that capitalist value is the only possible product. Being dedicated capitalists, I think the DEFRA leadership tends to be blind to other value forms and the sense that it could produce some other thing. I think it has produced other things in practice, and I've been running around England for the past 2 weeks talking to people who are using it. So will you still have to reckon with forces that push the valuation to be something that is functional for capital? Absolutely. Sure. It draws them out into the open, however, and names them. When an ecologist says to the regulator, your own method for valuing nature suggests that the multiplier should be 20. And the regulator says, but that would make it cost too much. You have found yourself at the working face of struggles over value. You are there, and everything's very clear. Many people have noted that such multipliers are patently absurd, okay? This is kind of a long tradition of noting how arbitrary these are. And keep in mind that all of these are internal critics who are working on elaborating wetland policy, often from an explicitly capitalist perspective. They're concerned about the scientific foundation of these claims. They want them to be more scientific and more defensible, right? So there's a lot of dissensus about what these numbers even mean, and that's great, right? It's a very fertile ground for getting in there and making it do something it wasn't supposed to do. Another set of, these are not like Dennis King is like super mainstream economic theorist on nature, right? These are resources for the future. So the practice of using multipliers stems from a 1976 report by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service called the Habitat Evaluation Procedure, or HEP, and looked at something like this in the abstract: area times condition times risk of failure. Okay? Why did they need this? Because by 1975, they had begun to start requiring compensation or offsets for the replacement of lost habitats and needed a method to define that obligation precisely. The first iteration of the question that comes down to us today as how do we measure the cleanup of the BP oil spill? Area times condition is the core and effectively creates a new regulatory object that can be managed, used in agency performance accounting, and of course, bought and sold. Can create something that ends up looking like a commodity or taking the commodity form, as Roman said. Area is not that controversial. I'm not sure what a hectare is, but I'm pretty sure we're not arguing about it. But once you start multiplying it by other things whose definition is not settled, you never really know where you're going to end up, especially when you've asked a bunch of ecologists to be in the room to tell you what the numbers are. So let's look at some historical cases of using this. Louisiana, 1983. The 1980 version of the HAP was used to calculate how many credits do you need to purchase in the very first wetland bank. And what you're looking at here is the first site ever developed by a third party to sell biodiversity credits. It's a Tenneco-Lataire wetland bank in southern Louisiana. How many credits do you need to buy? In this landscape, which is subsiding over time, it was subjected to a multiplier that changed its value over time. Natural marsh loss was calculated in this area from the scientific literature as saying that it would be open water by 2059 because of subsidence. The La Terre Bank then was designed to delay that subsidence through active management, so the site would continue to provide habitat benefits in excess of the non-project future for 77 years. Annualizing those benefits means that what it's selling is something called average annual habitat units. So a credit sold in 2016 has a lot less value than a credit sold in 1985, to the tune of about 1.24% of value lost per year. Regulators were able, because it's just three people sitting in a room trying to figure out how to do this, were able to force the value of these credits to reflect foreseeable future landscape changes. Minnesota, 1987. Minnesota, the state, has a big problem. A lot of roads, a lot of wetlands, very wet state. They're always building roads and running into wetlands. The State Department of Natural Resources also ended up using a system based on the HEP to measure how much replacement wetland the State Transport Agency needed to provide. The scientists at the DNR looked at HEP's instructions to multiply acreage by habitat value, and they thought, great, here's a chance to really apply all of our experience to the question of measuring habitat. And they went nuts on the task of making these habitat values as specific and precise as possible. They created a table of standard values for each of 9 wetland types. And this is hard to read, obviously, but what this is showing you is each of 9 types in each of 8 areas, 8 regions of the state, is measured by a different suite of species. And the value of common yellowthroat in District 7 for wetland type 2 is 20. That's an immense amount of embedded ecological knowledge. And they argued about it. Every year they would change it. And the Department of Transportation didn't care. They just pick up the phone, ask the DNR, how much do we need? This year it's 20. Okay. Lousy way of making a commodity. Fine way of having state agencies debate with each other about what needs to be done. Terrible way to make a commodity. So, on to DEFRA. That's, by the way, the regions in the state of Minnesota. That right there is about the size of England and Scotland combined. So, DEFRA released a biodiversity offsets pilot between 2012 and 2014. While widely regarded as a failure, I think that what actually happened is really interesting. DEFRA pointed to powers that local planning authorities, land use planning, already had to require offsetting. And they gave them a simple metric, much simpler than Minnesota's, to measure impacts and credits, and kind of walked away without really providing any real national context supporting mandatory or, in fact, consistent application. They gave this mechanism to the counties and said, do something good. The result has been, since the end of the pilot, a slow proliferation and uptake of offsetting by counties and planning authorities, some of whom, not many are using it, but those who do feel relatively free to tweak and change metrics very much to suit their own environmental planning goals in ways that developers had heretofore seen often as illegitimate. So DEFRA's basic metric is area times condition, and then multiplied by some more ratios. How distinctive is the habitat? How important is it in our sort of national context? Is there a risk that the site will fail to develop quickly? Is there a risk that it's too far from the site of impact? Is there a risk that it will fail to be delivered because it's hard to restore certain kinds of environments? So that's their basic framework. They provided very simplified ways of calculating each of these. On the one hand, DEFRA's rollout of biodiversity offsetting failed because, I think I'm paraphrasing Andy, I heard you sort of explain this at a different venue. The state was kind of too neoliberal to be neoliberal. Is that a, yeah, that too unwilling to erect the kind of mandatory protections that would have made offsets valuable and necessary. On the other hand, offsetting has in fact been quietly adopted at the district and sometimes the county level without national coordination, whereby the tools developed by DEFRA under the rubric very much of natural capital, and this is why it's not important not to take the national level dialogue too seriously, have been repurposed to serve entirely idiosyncratic agendas, often directly at odds with what you might call a neoliberal agenda. Warwickshire decided to create a different range of condition multipliers to allow ecologists to argue kind of idiosyncratically for values that were different from the specified ones. They are trusted or not, depending on the network of personal relationships. Somerset's protocol for measuring offsets, sorry, this is DEFRA's multipliers. This is Somerset. Similar in format, but the way you get those numbers is much more like Minnesota in 1987. It's based on HEP. In Somerset, they just went and they got the Habitat Evaluation Protocol from the US. They sort of figured out how to use it in their context. And as they said in their protocol, the DEFRA metric was considered inadequate for our purposes. That's a quote. They also got rid of spatial risk, as they said it either is or isn't in the right place, and that's up to us to decide, because we can. So just 2 examples, but it seems clear that the DEFRA imprimatur has given this way of measuring nature a legitimacy that gives ecologists at the planning table a sort of leverage to ask for things they couldn't ask for before. And because it's planning, it gets to be wrapped in with all sorts of social considerations with which it is not in the US. It is sort of firewalled off from the social in the US in a way it's not here, and that's quite refreshing to see. Both of these jurisdictions, Somerset and Warwickshire, see their use of offsetting as merely the extension of ecological planning strategies that extend well back into the 90s or even the 80s. Larry's point about what these markets are for, what carbon markets are for, is salient here. Offset markets are for a bunch of things: lowering regulatory compliance costs, legitimizing governance and making it reportable. Definitely some purposes friendly to the neoliberal project, and Larry has properly called these, in the realm of carbon, fudge factors. Yeah, but I think to suggest that they are simply and always a kind of a bit of magic dust that's sprinkled on the equation that allows nature to equal profit is wrong, and is sometimes wrong. Not always, but sometimes it's an extraordinarily powerful technology to get an answer that you want to get. And that's a power one should seek, I think. And importantly, it can be a resource for opposition. The science basis for ratios may be flimsy, but it's there. So if you say, look, you've imposed a 3 times multiplier on this project, but the science says it should be 10 times, suddenly you're just deep in the gears of project viability. Mike Rolband is not some guy. He's like the president of the National Mitigation Banking Association in the US. He's like, if mitigation ratio can't be predicted, you can't sell the product. You can get deep into the gears of project viability in this way, and just like Larry's alternative future baselines in carbon, they can both be used as a tool internally or their absurdity mocked externally, and do both. I think it's important to do both for whatever purpose suits you, to make the system work for unintended purposes or to break it or whatever. But in the end of the day, and I'm ending, it's important not to play gotcha by showing these systems to be kind of internally inconsistent or against the rules of ecology, economics, or mathematics. They're not, right? And they knew this from the beginning. The rules of mathematics may not be upheld by the Supreme. Of course they're not. You're multiplying like 10th times blue, divided by, I don't know. It's ridiculous. But the point is that they successfully make these absurd apparatic crossings that should be forbidden by logic. And that's a power I want to harness and use for good, right? I'm not saying offsetting is good or bad. It's inherently nothing. I'm pointing out that it brings us a technology evaluation that is accepted by the state, but is kind of pluripotent and poorly disciplined. One thing I am convinced of is that it's not very good at making commodities. But we should ask what valuations we can create with it for counter-hegemonic purposes. Thank you.
I'm really happy to be able to elaborate maybe a bit on what Romain and what Morgan have said, because from both of them I've learned so much in my own work over the past few years. I'm going to be ascending to what Morgan referred to as a sort of higher level of critique, but at the same time I'm going to be descending to more of a movement-oriented critique. So although I hope my presentation complements what Romain and what Morgan said, I hope I'll also be adding to it in a way which will help the discussion today. My basic questions are: what role do ecosystem services transactions actually play in self-expanding value? I think Morgan at the end was hinting in the direction of this question. How do these transactions actually contribute to capital accumulation, if at all? And the second question relates to the movements. How are struggles against ecosystem services transactions, which we see everywhere in the world, linked actually and potentially to other quote-unquote anti-capitalist struggles, to labor struggles or to anti-extractivism, for example? So remembering that capital accumulation is classically conceived as the accumulation of abstract social labor, And in fact presupposes the creation not only of exploitable wage labor, but also of appropriatable, resourcified, unpaid activities of humans and non-humans. And that requires re-engineering both the humans and the non-humans involved. It's only in this way that capital can be accumulated. But as people like Jason Moore and Nancy Fraser have reminded us very eloquently recently, behind wage labor lies this hidden abode, or sometimes not so hidden abode, of what Jason Moore likes to call the unpaid work of non-humans and of humans, without which you couldn't have that basic exploitation of labor, which creates capitalism, which creates capitalist value. And as Jason really emphasizes a lot, we should think of this as work, yes, activities, yes, but as unpaid activities. And in fact, invisibilized in some sense activities, and in fact, devalued. So capitalist value depends on the devaluation of the unpaid side of the equation. One interesting thing about this is when you try to increase your productivity of labor by mechanizing, for example, you're creating a higher value content in your labor process. One thing you need as a part of that is to have a much larger body of unpaid work to call on, including the unpaid work of women. Classically, I mean, Jason and these guys got all their inspiration really from the 1970s feminists, and the unpaid work of nature in all sorts of different kinds of respects. And again, this is unpaid, invisibilized in some sense, and devalued. Jason's way of looking at this is to say, well, okay, you want to increase your productivity of wage labor in order to get more capitalist value in the system. You're going to have to increase your ratio of unpaid labor, and the ratio is going to be sort of going up exponentially in a sense. And there's lots of examples of this, like between 2000 and 2010, coastal China. I mean, a huge boom in the production of capitalist value that depended not only on mechanizing, investing in mechanizing the coast of China, but it depended on extracting a lot of cheap coal and extracting a lot of cheap labor, which made the exports possible. I'll skip this other example and just conclude my opening remarks by saying that these processes are not only continuous, they're going on all the time, throughout the whole history of capital, but they're also always failing. They always fail. They're always incomplete. They're always vulnerable in many ways. I mean, it's an indeterminate kind of open-ended kind of process, and that's in part because of continuing refusals and evasions of capitalist labor, which go on all the time, and not excluding mundane battles over wages and numbers, numbers again, conditions and health. I mean, this is where a lot of the struggle is fought. And together with refusals of the resourcification of commons, which I would see as part of the same process as the refusals of the human labor. Famous slogan in a lot of indigenous movements in Latin America are territorios are not natural resources. Stop using that word. Together with the general progressive exhaustion or maxing out of the flexibility of capitalized, commensurated nature and reproduction of all kinds. So my question today is, how do ecosystem services fit into this picture? And I don't have an answer to this, and it's really hard. And Romain has helped me a lot with this, Morgan's helped me a lot with this, and I'm still working on it. And that's the question I'm throwing out today. But I'll put forward a hypothesis, which is certainly based a lot on Romain's very elegant paper, where he says, ecosystem services transactions are institutional responses to the threat to accumulation that environmental regulations pose. So it's really, it's a dialectic thing following on from regulation, not opposed to regulation. And I think that's absolutely true. So if we return to our picture of, how capital accumulation takes place, not only with the exploitation of factory labor and all the rest of it, but through this appropriation of all of these unpaid activities, unpaid labor of humans and non-humans, then we see, okay, there's a threat here posed by regulation. You interrupt this flow, you're interrupting the whole metabolism. You have to use the machines less, or you create less with the machines, or you have to invest in new machines. It's disrupting the process of capital accumulation, just like Romain says. And of course, behind regulation, we always have movements, because regulation doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of a whole process of social protest, which precedes it. So what are the possible responses from capital to this threat, as Roman puts it, from regulation? Well, there's many possible responses, just quickly 3 of them. I mean, one possible response is, of course, complete deregulation. Get rid of those regulations, which is not as popular a response as you might think, but it does happen. Another response is take hostages. As George Kavensis points out in climate summits, the green faction of capital, green economy, looks to the world working class and asks of it, are you willing to buy our stranded asset, oil, in the soil to the tune of trillions of dollars? Are you willing to make up for that with your own sort of raw, unassisted labor and pay us off what we would have gotten with the oil? And then there's a third response, which I'm going to talk about today, which is to re-regulate and to repair that appropriation pipeline, which goes from all of this unpaid work to the paid labor, which is the source of capitalist value. And this discussion certainly was started right at the time of the classic environmental regulations of the 1970s, when in the U.S. people were saying, well, gosh, this isn't going to work with accumulation. I mean, we have to make regulation more flexible. Maybe not ban it, but make it more flexible. And that was the start of really environmental services. This is an eloquent statement by the current head of the Bolsa Verde in Rio de Janeiro. He says, the objective is to transform, not abandon, transform environmental regulation into tradable instruments. What was the quotation from the ex-president of Chile the other day? Regulation has to not impair, but has to augment the market. I think George was mentioning that yesterday. This is, I think, a more precise statement of that with respect to environmental services. So what we have is a situation where, in addition to this pipeline, which is being repaired, in order to repair the pipeline, you need to start up another pipeline to sort of another new territory of humans and nature doing unpaid work, which provide these new things, which are not commodities, but they are, commensurable, exchangeable tokens which can be put into circulation. Things like tons of CO2 equivalent, global warming potential, species equivalents, so you can circulate all of these things. Units of functional lift, the latest ITMOs from the Paris Climate Conference, which I think stands for something like Internationally Transferable Mitigation, obligations. It's very interesting. Again, this is not a commodity, but it's, very interesting in relations with rent and land. But anyway, all of these things need to be in some sense produced, not as commodities, but produced as tokens of circulation, which can help repair, which can help keep this pipeline to your basic unpaid activities open. The catch, of course, is that this further realm of organized appropriation of nature, which involves all of these new natures, like not CO2, but CO2 equivalents, not species, but species equivalents. These new natures, their appropriation is subject to exactly, or more or less, the same kinds of contradictions as the original appropriations were subjected to. In other words, you have exhaustion, you have protests from people defending their land, and so forth. You have refusals from the humans whose activities form an integral part of the creation of these new tokens of appropriation, and so forth. So that's really all I have to say, but I want to paraphrase what I've just said and say it again in a different way, which maybe can help the discussion. This is just one example of the many protests around the world against ecosystem services, and which we all feel are somehow related to other anti-capitalist struggles, but sometimes we're hard put to say exactly how. Anyway, let me paraphrase what I've just said. Okay, well, this is sort of one summary. And one thing I do want to sort of close by saying is that questioning all of these things, including ecosystem services, is about anti-capitalist refusals supporting each other. And I think this is relevant to practical movement building, to try to get together labor movements, together with the anti-extractivist movements, together with movements which are battling thermodynamic energy and conversion engines, and that way of organizing nature together with the movements battling ecosystem services. But let me just paraphrase a little bit what I've said. Just as in previous eras, the techniques of creating, measuring, and circulating number 2 yellow corn, and this involves a lot of equivalence creation, a lot of creation of tokens, a lot of the sort of nitty-gritty work that Morgan was mentioning in connection with ecosystem services, or going further back, the techniques of increasing the rentability of European land in the 16th and 17th centuries using all sorts of equally nitty-gritty technologies like hedges and survey instruments and maps and measuring of all kinds. These were ways of bringing the unpaid work of non-humans cheaply out of the land and into circulation. All of these techniques, all of these tedious numbers help that become accomplished. And these numbers were actually embodied on the land, of course, like in things like hedges, which are very physical embodiments of this kind of technical work that Morgan was describing. So too, far from being ways of recognizing or increasing the value of nature, all of these new tokens of ecosystem services like CO2 equivalents and species equivalents and all of these things are ways of bringing the goods out of the land, are ways of getting the stuff out of the land. You can't do without them. You can't do without this sort of techniques. So we have all of this arcane numerology of the carbon markets, just as we have the arcane numerology that Morgan was describing and all of the disputes that go on with that in terms of biodiversity or wetlands offsets. It's unbelievably boring, but as Morgan said, it's unbelievably political at the same time, the creation of all of these equivalents. And they all go toward creating these circulatable commodities, which governments, which states create and companies have access to. Just as with the transactions in units of number 2 yellow corn or 17th century land survey, and the ecosystem service token transactions also change what the land itself is. Number 2 yellow corn changed what the U.S. Midwest was. It changed what the land itself was. And it's the same with the ecosystem services. So that if in the past few centuries much capitalist territory has been redesigned to mass produce certain units that are abstract, measurable, isolatable, transportable, reproducible in a capitalist economy, for example, commercial grain or livestock varieties, so too the new capitalist territory or capitalist nature of ecosystem services, including its human inhabitants, is designed to mass produce new elements that are also isolatable, measurable, transportable, reproducible, and in some senses even more abstract. And to return to my basic point, my concluding point, this is no less a way of externalizing nature than your classical extractivist or resource politics. And Morgan and others have pointed out how, again, this tends to render it a static, governable, non-mutable landscape. The relevant science is just a continuation, really, of the long colonialist tradition of capitalist science of treating the non-human world as a globe of resources dichotomized from human beings, which is an anti-commons tradition and recognized as such by many popular movements opposing ecosystem services. Punchline. Techniques for creating and measuring ecosystem services are not ways of valorizing, but rather of devaluing and re-externalizing the unpaid work of non-humans in order to shore up the productivity of wage labor against the threat of conventional environmental regulation, meaning ultimately the threat from commons and environmental movements, which are emerging more and more clearly as public enemy number 1 of capital. I think Kostas was saying yesterday, return of land into the capitalist battles is something which is happening all around us. And this is, I think, something we should keep in mind when thinking about movements and the growing opposition from peasants and indigenous peoples who understand ecosystem services as continuous with extractivism, colonialism, and Cartesianism, and as a repudiation of their common rights and knowledge. I mean, these are just some of the things from around the world that people have said about ecosystem services. I'll just run quickly through them. Bullet to kill my people, country disrupted by merchants, peasants retaking their land in Nigeria, biggest land grab in history, no to carbon trading against a protester against coal-fired power plants, defending land in Uganda, back to Thailand, carbon destroying movement, worst forms of neoliberal fanaticism, the most absurd and impossible market human civilization has ever seen, referring to the carbon market in particular there. Mexico, use of wind farms in Mexico to generate ecosystem services credits, South Africa, anti-red demonstrations, and in solidarity with them, California environmental justice movements. So I'll end there. Thank you.
the idea here is to present a bit of kind of reflections on two cases that we visited of communities that are directly impacted by projects of setting, biodiversity of setting, one in Madagascar and one in Mongolia. But before that, I would like to make a kind of introduction to it, which is really to try to make a distinction when we look at people who are opposing a certain model, and distinguish like the different perspectives that people may have depending on who they are and where they come from. So to use a kind of how can I call it, like an interesting stimulation that we got from an author from Latin America, whose name is Raul Zibecki. He's based in Uruguay. He's talking to make a very clear distinction about what does it mean to be kind of on the front line in the different parts of the world. He talks about people who live in the area of being. I think we are a clear example of this type of people. And people who live in the area of the non-being. So the difference is that when you are in the area of being, you are in a context where normally your rights are respected, or at least you know that there is a frame of rights which are kind of defining everything about your life. When you live in the area of the non-being, so in the area of being, violence is kind of the exception, and this is where people get shocked when it happens. When you live in the area of non-being, violence is the rule for your daily life, and there are no rights, and the institutions, including the states, quite often are seen as people, as simply the engine of that repressing machinery, which is bringing violence into their life constantly. So what makes the difference is that you have a different horizon. So if you live in the area of being, your horizon are the existing institutions for the majority of the people. I mean, you feel that your right is being violated, never mind what is your right, and you have in mind a set of institutions who should restore a situation where your rights are fully respected. If you live in the area of non-being, what you are looking for is rather spaces of self-organizing and spaces of autonomy where you are actually able to build, to kind of take care about the community needs. The perspective very often is of a community, of a group. It's not the individual. This is kind of changing a lot. When we talk about people in the area of non-being, we talk of people that are mostly invisible for the majority of the rest. The rest are the kind of wealthy Western Europeans or others. And these are people that become visible only in very specific moments and contexts. This is where everyone is kind of excited and looking at them. But we often forget that they have a way of organizing, which is very probably based on values that are very different from ours. But they do have it, and they do know what they need, and they are kind of constantly taking care of themselves much more than we do. So it's like people that are fully conscious that they have to take care about themselves, and they have to be organized in order to do it and not to be completely destroyed by the machinery of repression. So the activists and the academics, and I'm saying that because there were several moments when people were thinking about how to build this connection between academics and activists, they enter this area of non-being potentially when basically they exit their comfort zone. And And this happens when you are able to base your action on a relationship that is based on reciprocity and mutual respect with the others. So you are not in the position of knowing what should be done, but you are just sitting at the same table and discussing and seeing, trying to understand if potentially you can find a common political horizon and a way of collaborating. Looking at these cases of biodiversity offsetting, I think that the communities that we met are predominantly in the area of non-being, and the main problem that they faced is with the conservation NGOs, who definitely come from the area of being, and that basically approached them, simply telling that the forest where they used to grow their food is now a protected area. And so they simply cannot plant the manioc there anymore, and anything else can be like, they cannot do any activity in that forest. This is in the case of Madagascar. And they are basically part of the same violent and quite arrogant machine that actually perpetrate the dispossession at their cost. The first part of the presentation will be on the Oyu Tolgoi mine in Mongolia. So we are basically in the South Gobi Desert. The actor in both of the projects that we visited is Rio Tinto, which is one of the largest mining companies in the world, headquartered in London. And it's like a British-Australian partnership kind of corporation. So the interesting thing about this project is that Rio Tinto is having a kind of corporate biodiversity strategy where they claim that they will have a net positive impact on the biodiversity of the Southern Gobi region. So they aim to reach this goal by mine closure, but will seek opportunities to achieve net positive impact as early as practicable in the project life. This is a picture taken by the small fact-finding mission of people of which we were part of in the Gobi Desert. So as you see, I mean, you imagine how life is organized there. There are people living here. I mean, it's not an empty place on the world. But you may imagine that it should be organized in a different way than we organize it here. This is the Oyu Tolgoi is the largest mining investment license in Mongolia. I don't know the wideness of the territory, but I know it's a 10 billion investment, and it is operating. So it is the first project to include a biodiversity offset action and a biodiversity management plan made with the guidance of the Biodiversity Consultancy of Cambridge. So these are some of the people that we met. They are nomadic people. They are predominantly living off the animals that they can herd. There is like the amount of grass, of course, is very limited. So families, they have their own rules in terms of who can stay where, how many animals they can have, if they move, where they go, and how the thing is functioning. There are very, very specific rules for living in such a place. The main impact that the mine is having is that it actually completely broke the ecosystem and the territory. They have been building roads, they have been mining, of course. There are trucks running in the kind of roads that they built. The water is decreasing, and this is everything is just ongoing. So the fragmentation of the natural habitat is one of the main problems, and it is affecting the life of the people. Just to make it short, the kind of management plan, which is really only about these few things that you can see here. There is a lot of uncertainty on what they want to do, how they want to do it, what do they mean by biodiversity offsetting. But basically, they are saying to the people, okay, only 30% of the grass is now not impacted by the extraction. So in order to protect it, you should kind of reduce the number of animals that you are having. And that's it. So, I mean, it is really the burden on the people. The baseline, there are scientists already working in the area because they need to understand what is the impact on the wild species that are living there. There is a kind of wild donkey, there is a kind of gazelle, which are very specific from there. But basically, when the study is still ongoing and there is no baseline produced, there are still the mining operations. And basically, nobody knows if there will ever be a real plan for the offsetting. Nobody will know what will be the precondition because there is no study assessing the precondition. If we go to Madagascar, the context is again Rio Tinto having an ilmenite mine. They have like many different activities in Madagascar and in other places, but this specific place was advertised by the company as the biodiversity offsetting project. So they looked for Madagascar because of the very unique context there. There are a lot of endemic species in Madagascar that are not present in other places, so they thought that by presenting a biodiversity offsetting plan, it was kind of more allowed for them to do the kind of destructive operations that they normally do. So the specific area is an area of coastal forest, which is kind of unique. Again, also here they claim they will have a net positive impact on the biodiversity. They went a bit farther here because they actually claim that in any case the residents would have destroyed the forest. So we should thank them because first they convinced the government to create a protected area in that location. Never mind if the location is within their mining license, but there is a protected area, and without them, it wouldn't have been there. And then, because they will do the offsetting, in one way or the other, the forest will be protected. So this is the line of the company. This is the kind of the landscape near the community that was visited. We talk about the Singambarika forest, and the offsetting side is called Bermangidi. So what are the criticalities? There is this kind of neo-colonial approach to the residents, where the traditional use of land is seen as irrational, inefficient, and the villagers were not informed at all about the overall plan. They didn't know that that area is basically now they have a prohibited access because it should compensate for the other project of Rio Tinto, which they know very well. The restrictions are very severe because basically we talk of people that live of subsistence agriculture, so the fact that they cannot plant in the forest anymore is pushing them into sandy areas more near the coast, where basically they gather less than 1/5 of production than they used to have. So before they could feed their families, now they cannot. They need money to buy food, they don't have money. If they violate the forest, they have to pay fines, which are very heavy, and they don't have the money to pay them. So they are kind of trapped, and they feel that the conservation NGO, which was part of the setting up of the plan, is for them is part of the problem, because this is like one of the testimonies, and basically taking away the access to the forest for them is like evicting them, because I mean either they can go there to grow their food or they will have to go away and nobody knows where they should go. I quickly move to the conclusion. So what we think is that the kind of equation that we are trying to get through biodiversity offsetting is totally impossible. Communities end up taking the burden of this, what we call a double land grab, because on one side, one part of the territory is taken away by the mining project in these two cases, and then another area of land is taken away from them because of the offsetting. It is a mechanism that is imposed on people, which, as I was saying before, are in the area of non-being, that is basically allowing the extraction of wealth out of their lives and out of the living environment, which is really a paradox, because it is also helping the regeneration of the image of the company. So the question, to have just a final remark, should not be around how to improve it and how to, avoid human rights violations and all that sort, but rather on how to build alliances with those people who are resisting it. Thank you.
So, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. I identified myself with the way Morgan presented himself. I'm also a double agent. I use part of my time to develop critical theory, but I also spend a lot of time involved in reports for governmental and intergovernmental bodies that are oriented to support decisions in environmental policy. So in my condition of double agent, I've been deeply concerned with the question of whether nature evaluation and environmental justice may be compatible or not. In the German ideology, Marx portrays as one of the most outstanding characteristics of capitalism its capacity to simultaneously deploy productive and destructive forces. One of its most outstanding self-legitimation mechanisms, I would add, is to have been able to develop accounting, valuation, and institutional systems that systematically registers all these benefits of the productive process, while at the same time masking the massive social and environmental costs which are associated to the same production process. So actually, economic development and growth bears enormous unaccounted social and environmental costs, for instance, in terms of pollution and related health problems, that we in the economic jargon often refer to as externalities. So these costs rarely appears in company balance sheets or macroeconomic accounts unless they are claimed through court cases or unless public regulation mandates their internalization. So the machinery of accumulation and growth have left behind an enormous track of ecological destruction. And if we look at the state of the environment 50 years after the launch of modern environmentalism, we see that humanity has been never moving faster nor further from sustainability than now. This has led to the emergence of a growing pessimism among environmentalism regarding traditional approaches to conservation, and to the emergence of so-called new environmental pragmatism, which is this idea that we have lost the battle of trying to save nature based on the idea of its intrinsic values, etc., and that if we want to make a case to convince power about acting for nature conservation, etc., we have to adopt their own language, the language of power, which in a capitalist economy is essentially money. So this new environmental pragmatism makes the case of making broader use of economic valuation and markets incentives for environmental protection. And this has deployed in a number of changes in the way we frame, value, frame and value nature and how we inform decisions. So I think the Pandora box was opened with the concept of ecosystem services, when it became so central in environmental policy. I would talk of the adoption of this concept, but also of the co-option of this concept, because contrary to what is often assumed, it's not a concept that was introduced by market environmentalists or economists. It was actually introduced by ecologists in the 1960s, in the 1970s and 80s, and the idea was to highlight or to look at ecosystems as life support systems. So not something like distant out there recreational areas, aesthetic things, etc., but actually the very material foundation of life and long-term economic viability. That was the original idea of the concept. But of course, ecologists maybe were naive here when they thought they could convince economists by adopting their own language. So when they started to frame nature as natural capital and the functions in terms of services, they started to pave the way for further movements in this direction. So one thing is to recognize a use value in nature. I personally have no big problems with that. Another big step is taken when we assume that that use value might be commensurable in economic terms, which is what has been happening through all these reports, such as the Stern report on climate change, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, etc., which are measuring nature in economic terms. To be fair, with the community of people conducting these valuations, not all of them are in favor of commodification of nature. Many of them see them only as a tool for awareness raising. So for instance, Bob Costanza, which is one of the gurus of this field, came with this famous paper that tried to quantify the economic value of the world's natural capital and ecosystem services, trying to pay attention to all that hidden value that we are not taking into account. No? And he believes we should stop the process here and not move further into markets and so on. I've criticized this view talking about the tragedy of well-intentioned valuation, which actually is about understanding that when we create discursive framings and metrical technology, we are paving the way for further stages in the commodification process. So even if Costanza did this with the best of the intentions, of course there are parallel agendas out there, and many saw the right side of the cheese as an enormous fresh space for further accumulation. So what was the next step in the commodification process was not only demonstrating theoretically these values, but designing institutions through which these theoretical values could be converted into real cash flows. And this has been done mostly through two families of instruments. On the one hand, ecosystem and pollution markets, which are largely based on the so-called polluter pays or degrader pays principle. And we've been talking a lot of examples in this room. And the other side of the coin, which would be so-called payments for ecosystem services, which would be based on the idea of the provider gets principle. So the first one is mostly designed to deal with negative externalities. If you create negative externalities, you have to pay for that. The second one is to compensate for positive externalities. If you contribute to these ecosystem services, etc., you should get a compensation for that. So obviously the problem we have at hand here is the problem of commodification of nature. And when I've been trying to raise this issue in my technocrat circles, a response that I got very often is, well, what's new under the sun? I mean, ecosystem goods and services have been sold and bought in markets for thousands of years, some of them, which is true. But there is a difference when we think of physical ecosystem goods, because in that case, what we are commodifying is mostly the human, but also the animal labor behind the production. Whereas when we start commodifying things such as water regulation, carbon sequestration, habitat provision, and so on, we are actually not compensating for any form of effort or work. We are actually just creating new forms of rent. We are basically allowing to appropriate the work that nature is doing and allowing people to derive a rent of that, which is exactly the type of observation that led Proudhon to refer to this type of appropriation or to property as theft. this idea that we can appropriate public goods produced by nature and sell them in markets is very new in economic thinking, actually. If we look at the work of the classics, which did not use the term ecosystem services, but they used it avant la lettre, using natural forces and so on, we would find these sort of messages in Marx, Ricardo, even Adam Smith. So, for instance, if we read Jean-Baptiste Say, he said, "The wind which turns our mills and even the heat of the sun work for us, but happily, no one has yet been able to say the wind and the sun are mine, and the service which they render must be paid for." Something interesting to pick up at a time when payments for ecosystem services are becoming such a strong tool. So, how is the way, the dominant framing of this unaccounted social environmental cost, the one that is dominating most international reports and so on? Basically, it's this idea that the origin and the solution to environmental problems is to be found in the technical domain. Basically, this idea that portrays externalities as market failures that result from a failure of the markets to internalize these social and environmental costs into the pricing system. So this is embedded in a vision that takes the market as the essential institutional structure defining what is inside and what is outside the societal system of choice. And of course, it's a very clear example of this techno-managerial sort of tendency to which Ringet or Rancière and others are pointing. So basically, political issues are being hidden behind sort of technical framings, or at best, framed in moralizing ways. I like very much how Chantal Mouffe puts it. She says, there's no longer left and right, there's only right and wrong. So the sad thing is that the right stays and the left is gone. Now, there is an alternative framing of this problem, which is the tradition that says the way we distribute costs and benefits and the outcomes we have nowadays are not the sort of smooth unfolding that we find in the liberal economic literature, but that actually puts a lot of weight of which is the political agency, including violence, that is involved in how costs and benefits are actually distributed. Most well known maybe is the work by, in volume 1 of Primitive Accumulation, on how the role that slavery and the dispossession of the commons put in motion the machinery of accumulation, a process that authors like Federici and Harvey have noted that has been extending into the present. So political ecology has done very well in feeding from this sort of theory, which I think is fundamental to understand how things are occurring. But it's actually this way of framing has failed so far to produce or to communicate this information in a way that could have, to the reach of my knowledge, meaningful institutional, legal, and economic impact. So if I may use the metaphor, my parents tell me that in the 70s it was common to tell a joke in progressive circles that they said, so how do you divide work in your home? They said, and he answers, well, my wife takes care of the little things like food, clothing, and so on, and I take care of the big things like capitalism, the Vietnam War, and these ideas. No? So I think sometimes that political ecology has a little bit of this problem, that is sometimes failing to, even if I fully agree and use this type of understandings, it's failing to sort of engage. Oh my God, only 1 minute. Anyway, this puts it in the dilemma that, for instance, Harvey has framed in this term. He says, at this point, the critique of money valuation is faced with this dilemma. Eschew the language of daily economic practice and political power and speak in the wilderness, or articulate deeply held non-monetizable values in a language, that of money, believed to be inappropriate and fundamentally alien. The message I wanted to throw here today is that if the first option, which is this so-called new environmental pragmatism, is a wrong way to go, which is something that has been widely discussed here, I would say that the second one, like taking total distance from any evaluation processes that are dominating now the policy agenda, might also be a very ineffective way to go. And it might be reproducing this thing that, for instance, Zizek has criticized of the New Left, which is this idea of like stepping back into distant, morally safe positions and not get your hands dirty with the mud of real life politics, right? So I wonder if one way to go could be to say, well, maybe what we have to do if we want to really have one foot in the struggle for the hegemony of ideas is to actually appropriate nature valuation for purposes of environmental justice. But to succeed in doing so, I believe this means reframing the way we the conceptualization, valuation languages, and institutions that are guiding policies to tackle social environmental costs. I have to close, right? Well, 2 points only to finish. First one, how did we surrender the term values and valuation so easily to liberal economists? Value is about the importance of things and how we ascribe meaning to things. And it's also about the principles and convictions that guide the way we understand we should behave towards nature and towards other people. And we don't have to go to radical sources to this sort of understanding of value. Looking at the Oxford Dictionary is enough. The second point I wanted to make is that if we want to tackle social environmental costs, we have to reframe them in a political way. And I would like to pay attention to the work of William Kapp, an author that I think we should read much more. And he wrote this book in 1950, which is called The Problem of Social Cost. And Kapp reacted to the portrayal of environmental problems as accidental externalities to be internalized in the price system. And rather, he conceptualized them as cost-shifting successes through which powerful actors manage to impose the costs of their economic activity into less powerful actors, very often into future generations, the poor, and to other species. So basically, capacity to pollute or deplete resources at zero cost may not reflect a market failure as much as a power asymmetry.
We need to make space for questions.
We have to close. So basically, my final message. I believe we cannot give away or surrender so easily the whole domain of environmental values and valuation to liberal economists. I think we have to reappropriate this value, and we have to try to articulate or even impose our own valuation languages which are more appropriate to the problems at hand. But even economic valuation can be, under certain circumstances, a tool that can be used for environmental justice. And the example that I didn't have time to address is how liabilities in courts are being used by local and indigenous communities sometimes to suit, for instance, international cooperation in costs in order to get compensations for environmental damages. Thanks so much. Sorry for the bad time.
So, in your last slide, you wrote, Professor Goretti, decide which externalities we analyze. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think it's one of the last points.
Yes.
So I want to ask you,
No.
do you imply here that you agree that several environmental costs or parts of nature are considered externalities? Because it's a very specific framing, I mean, to say that these are externalities that should be internalized.
Absolutely. I mean, the problem with the...
Because you today, you know, to what I refer, that in the Marxist literature, you read that this is not actually externality because it's included in the production process.
Mm-hmm.
This is my point.
Well, but basically the problem with the concept of externalities is that it takes for granted that the market is the sort of natural institutions where things have to be internalized or externalized, no? And it's positively framed as, externalities is automatically framed as something negative, whereas it might be very good to extract some things from the market and putting under the logic of other types of institutions, no? This is what we did with the abolition of slavery, or what we did with the abolition of the practice of selling spiritual indulgences in the Middle Ages, right? But now we are doing sometimes the opposite, and we internalize externalities that should remain outside the market, as we do, for instance, with carbon offsetting and so on, and we create these new environmental indulgences that allow polluters and degraders to get away only through economic payments. So I think it's terribly problematic in that sense, and precisely this concept of the social cost of William Kapp did not take for granted the market should be the sort of reference institution to define what is in and what is out.
Okay, if there's another question, Rocío has just told me now that it's a 3 minutes presentation. If everybody's okay with that, we just give Rocío the space.
Thank you. I'll stand up maybe so you can see me. Yeah, I wanted to present in this session. I'm going to just summarize a paper that I finished recently writing, which is called The Centrality of Labor in Green Capitalist Economies, and it's a case study from Senegal. So I'm trying to distinguish labor in nature-based tourism and labor that is being used in mangrove reforestation carbon projects. I'm focusing on labor because the conservation and capitalism literature has tended to not take into account much the role of labor, so they are talking about the commodification of nature. So in my case, I'm using also Romain Sperli's idea of climate rent to distinguish it from labor in nature-based tourism, which is oriented to the production of commodities, and these commodities are the services that are sold to tourists. So for instance, preparing food in a restaurant, a tour to tourists. My question is how workers are experienced in different ways this development of the green capitalist economy. So I'm looking at commodity production in hotels and how workers are experiencing it. And yes, I'm kind of exposing the exploitation of the Senegalese people in hotels, and also the imperialist character of this economy. Most of the hotels are owned by Europeans, and if not by Senegalese nationals who are also part of the state. And the Senegalese who are working there are people who have been historically expropriated in different ways and separated from the conditions of their own existence. So I make this distinction between climate rent and commodity production and destruction of surplus value in nature-based tourism, because I want to understand also how that distinction can allow us to understand the ways in which workers, the transformations that these economies are producing in their everyday lives. And what I've seen is that because nature-based tourism is oriented to the extraction of surplus value, it continues. It requires a continuous use of labor. Whereas mangrove reforestation projects have only used labor for several days because they were only oriented for the production of a climate rent. And once it was produced, they didn't need any more the workers. So at the same time, I find some commonalities between these two cases, and it's the use of poor people by a powerful minority, and the exploitation of labor. And I also try to expose how absolute and relative surplus value in nature-based tourism materializes in long days of work, people losing their jobs, and multitasking, etc. And I think these processes should not be hidden, and for that I think Marx's theory of capital and his critique of political economy can be very used to bring the labor and workers' experiences in emerging green capitalist economies.
All right, thank you very much, Rocío.
I have a question to Elena on these shocking examples also which you presented in Mongolia and Madagascar. And we see at the one side that you have a big mining impact, and then you have, as you say, the double impact of having offsetting, which has a big impact as well on the livelihoods of the people. And I was just wondering, I mean, you make clear that there's a difference between the non-being and the being work. I think you kind of and that the situation is quite different in these countries than in others, which we are more used to. But still, I just wonder how these, were these impacts that the people would have not known beforehand. Did anybody not look at them, or was it taken willingly into account that these people would suffer? How can such a decision be taken? I think interested to get more insight why it was done that way.
But we have Nuria and
I just said there was an article published in National Geographic about the good examples of Rio Tinto in Madagascar, so it's really strange why that they were consulted in front actually. And that people, like the international community, believe that it's actually a good example.
First time, today's is a really intense, really exciting, really good day, so please everybody write your presentations and articles, and I can't wait to read the special issue of GeoForum, which has so many good ideas. Just a comment, I think, to the last two, Eric and Morgan, which is the experience, what I was going to present in your session that I didn't, because I ended up in the first one talking about something else. I think the danger, I completely agree, and Eric and I were talking about it, that you have to engage and get dirty in the mat, and these things are there, and we have to engage with them in some way. There's huge danger in that, which doesn't mean we don't have to. I just that we have, and we know that. And I was just very brief the experience with us. We engaged with water markets, because we thought water markets were. It could be a useful tool, very regulated, very small, this little thing that we put all sorts of regulations around it, and there was a wide consensus in Spain to introduce water markets as a way to change a very powerful, dominating paradigm that we perceive to be undemocratic and inequitable, environmentally destructive. And we said, okay, well, this might help produce that change. Well, it's like an amoeba, it's like a little monster. You put it in and it changes. It has its own life, and it has its own. It's like a being, really. And at the end, and you see it again and again, all the protections you could keep being taken off, and it assumes a life of its own, and it ends up being what it is, which is a market force to do something. And you see the other examples. I've been recently in some forums in which they use, there are good examples of water markets. They work well in Australia, for instance. It's the golden example. It works very well. Well, it turns out that they just passed a regulation that is starting to take some of the protections out already. So I think these things are these dangerous things that we try to, we engage with them. We have to engage, and I agree completely. And we experiment and we make mistakes, and the outcomes are not what we expect. I just think that we have to be very aware that they have an entity of their own. And at the end, they end up being what they are, what their essence really is, and not what we try to make them to be. We take Gabriela, and then give the floor, and then Alison and Brian, maybe.
So it's a question that could go to any one of you, and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to explain it. But it's something that has been that I'm concerned about these days when hearing about carbon offsetting, and it's the fact that it seems to be based on the idea that we know so much already about ecosystems that we can destroy something in some place and then reproduce something equally functional somewhere else. And since these are not cars, that living systems have emergent properties that we are still learning about, I guess that it could be the case that we could be reproducing these ecosystems elsewhere and like making them faulty because they have certain features that we still don't know about, so we aren't able to reproduce. I don't know if this makes sense. So I'd like to know how this has been dealt with, because I don't think it's a matter of multiplying the acres, as you said. It's like saying 10 times blue. If it's something qualitative and quantitative that you're not taking into account, then that's it. Yeah.
Someone say
Well, I can I'd like to address both of those. First, no, I mean, yes, it's always very dangerous. And that's kind of, it's a little too flippant to say there's always a danger of your sort of policy products going wrong, but that's not unique to market-based policy. That's any policy. You know, I mean, I think, you know, the environmental initiatives of the early 1970s, the United States had, you know, at all levels, had no market-based component, and they went in directions that were deeply troubling to all of the authors of those policies. And I mean, that sounds like a kind of a flippant answer, but I don't know that that's unique to markets. And the idea that they're always going to end up being their sort of essential market self, I'm not convinced of that in the smaller markets that I look at that are based in biodiversity and sort of very space and place specific objects, and that's very different than carbon. And the space between what carbon markets do and can do and what these things called habitat and wetland banks do, you can't trade wetlands. You know, even in the sort of most permissive, sort of careless geographical framing in the US, you can't trade wetlands more than like 20 or 30 miles away from the site of impact. I mean, for all kinds of reasons that should have more to do with ecology than they do, but they just administrative boundaries and all that. There's no, you know, global trading, and that creates a very thin and small market that is unusually responsive to non-market factors in there. So I'm going to plead a little bit of exceptionalism there. With regard to the other question, I had the answer on the tip of my tongue. I'm going to pass it over to Eric because I remember what I was going to say. But you were about to say something.
Okay, so starting there, I mean, the message I was trying to give was that we need to engage, and that political ecologists should engage in the problem of how to tackle the problem of unaccounted social and environmental costs. Now, which are the evaluation languages and the institutions that should be promoted to tackle this problem? That is an open question. It can be through public regulation, it can be through justice courts, and maybe some things can be through markets. This is a debate that political ecology is not confronting in a serious way. What is, even if we think of a socialist project, which is the role of markets, we may consider in that project. This is something Lenin had to confront very early, just to put an example. And this links a little bit to your question. So what can be the role of markets? First of all, we have to face the fundamentally political question of which things we believe should be for trade and which things should not. And of course, there are ethical and political considerations here of justice, and maybe some are technical as well. So for instance, the degree of fungibility of different things. I mean, I have lots of problems with carbon markets for other reasons, but I think from the technical point of view, I think they might be eventually feasible, because I can buy this idea that a ton of carbon here is relatively similar to a ton of carbon here. I have many other problems with that, but when it comes to the technical side. Now, I will never buy, trained as an ecologist as I am, I will never buy this idea that we can reproduce a hectare of ecosystem here in another place. First of all, because you have to destroy or mask all other values that are attached to these ecosystems. And these are not only ecological values of biodiversity and land and so on, but there are also cultural values that people attach to that place and that you cannot reproduce elsewhere. No? So I think it's fundamentally a political question, but eventually there are also technical issues that have to do, for instance, to the degree to which you can reproduce something through artificial means at another place.
I remembered where I was going with that too. Yeah, of course, what you've done with ecosystem and services markets is you've called into the room a bunch of ecologists who are going to say exactly what you just said, right, about the nature of what it is you're trying to define. And they're going to push that, they're going to say, look, there are unknowns, it's complicated, there's landscape level effects, and they're going to push it in a direction where it becomes impossible to define a fungible object that's equivalent to anything else, because it is in the end unique to its place, right? And this is recognized, actually it's recognized in the deferometric, in the defense of why it's very sort of general. And the smart sort of policy designers say this, that you can either define a unit that is ecologically precise, or you can define it so that it's fungible. There's a zero-sum game between them. And where you find that point is actually quite open, right? Yes, if you go to the extreme of ecological sort of truth to ecological principles, you will define something that's extremely precise and is kind of, from a policy standpoint, not equivalent to any other thing that policy is asking it to be equivalent to. So that's the battle. Where do you push it to the most general, most fungible end, in which case it's very functional for capital, but it's not for ecology. See, there's a spectrum there, and that's where the fight is, to move something one way or the other.
On the impacts on people, if it was accounted or not that there would be people who will suffer. First of all, I would invite you to read the full report. So, like, this presentation is really was given in a very fast way, so not all the elements are there. But the main thing around, for instance, Madagascar, is that people were promised to be able to integrate their income by being employed in the activities of planting trees in the protected area. So the problem is that this should have kind of guided or supervised by these environmental NGOs, which is local and connected to, I think it's BirdLife International, but you can choose one of the many conservation groups who do it, and it's just not happening. Or when it was happening, it was for a very short time, in a very kind of random way. They were coming to the community and saying, we need 10 people today, and then 10 people were kind of showing up, and everybody else was left with the lack of food and no capacity of any way to making any income. So it's like, it's an approach where on paper you say something, then when you go and you see the reality there, you realize it's completely different. And for us, it was quite like sensitive to go there, and even the report that if you have the patience to read, you can find it. It's in English, in Malagasy, and in I think in Italian, of course. Basically, the report was written and shared, translated the draft into Malagasy, shared with the communities. So the local interpreter and the local partner that we had went back to the community. They confronted with them on everything about the content. We integrated the comments, and then the report was made. So it was just like to say that for us it was really sensitive that the people there needed to be 100% sure that what was in the report was really what they felt about the project, and at the same time, the demand to have such a report was not coming from Italy, because we don't have any direct interest there. There are no Italians involved for once, but the demand was coming from Madagascar, because people felt they knew nothing of what was going on there, and they felt that there was a lot of promotion of this project, as you know, the way out, so they can mine the island, because now we have offsetting. And so, this is just to say, in Mongolia, what is happening is, it's also quite crazy, if you want to say, because the herds are suffering already a loss of animal because of the activities of the mine. They have put fences to close certain parts of the desert, and their animals died when they try to cross the fences. So it's a situation where they suffer directly from animals who die because of that, because the big trucks are just killing them, because there is less water. And what is happening is that people are just giving up and they are starting to work for the mine. And that's the thing. I mean, they are pushing people to leave their way of living, which is, in any case, you know, that nomadic people are kind of never sympathetic to anyone. And they are just telling them, okay, leave the thing, it's too hard, it's such a hard life, go and work for the mines. And this is kind of the main discourse. This is having also a counter effect, which is related to the biodiversity of setting part of the project, because basically the herders, they are the people who are actually controlling the territory. So they know if there are people coming in for illegal hunting or not, and normally they are the same workers of the mine or other of the new people, let's say, that came in with this big business. So the less herders you have, the more you will have all sorts of illegal activities connected to killing of the wild animals, which are then taken just across the border to China, because the main kind of market for that type of activity is in China, which is just very close to the border. So it's a very kind of crazy situation, and again, it's not easy to kind of work.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I think that a topic that was shared by almost all of the presentations, although in different levels, was the role of scientists, or the role of the production of knowledge in the development and reproduction of market-based conservation policies. I would argue that it's really important to make explicit this role. It was really clear in Morgan's presentation, but also in Kelly's presentation when he mentioned the role of land use planning. I pretty much agree with Larry Doman when he expressed that these techniques, for its evaluation methods, these techniques to measure ecosystem services are not ways to create value, but rather a way to mobilize that value, or to distribute that value as a form of land rent, as Ferry would argue. And I think that the role of scientists in mobilizing these values, or to develop models for that mobilization, is really, really important. Just would like to mention the example of the Payment for Ecosystem Services program in Mexico, which is the largest in the world. The role of environmental economists to develop, for instance, an index for deforestation risk, which is pretty much based in a Buntunet's model of efficient land use. It's definitely, in my opinion, it's definitely changing or transforming the landscape in rural areas in Mexico. I don't want to overestimate it, but in really important biodiversity hotspots, these kind of models, it's really transforming the landscape. I just would like to give very brief data. Like, for instance, the Mexican program for payment for ecosystem services allocated approximately $450 million to enroll more than 2.6 million hectares of land. So if you think about the scope of the program, but also the idea underlying the development of these land use models, I think it's kind of like a rationale to make more explicit the role of scientists in the mobilization of standards.
Okay, and then we have Charlotte, and I'll pass on. Yeah, actually, just a very brief question for Elena again. So, yeah, the people are informed now that what went wrong, and that they were not informed about the real impacts of these cases. But what are the next steps now? Are you going to try to talk with Rio Tinto, look for solutions, or what are the next steps?
Yes, another question on the back, and then we get
And I have another question from Elena as well. But I mean, your presentation was completely inspiring, and I have this worry that maybe I share with you this morning, is how
that international NGOs works with different territorialities when they go to different places. Because we were talking about the mistakes when we generalize. It doesn't matter if we're talking about water or if we're talking about environmental problems. So you were making that point here, but I really want to know how does how does the NGOs, the international NGOs, work when they confront different territorialities, different contexts, different people, different approaches?
All right, we can give space for answers.
Okay, so on the next steps, Madagascar, there is an open discussion with the groups there. So for them, they have national priorities. For them, the main responsible of the thing behind Rio Tinto is their own government, who's basically allowing all of that. So there are people who have that type of horizon of work, and we are kind of trying to see where do they want to go, what do they see as a priority, and then we will find our way of supporting them, basically. Denouncing Rio Tinto for sure is something that we are doing, and we are doing it with groups that are opposing the company for the direct impacts of their activities globally. Along here in the UK, there is a group called London Mining Network. We work closely with them. There are other groups who are active. In Mongolia, there are a long list of financial institutions who are pouring money into the mining project and are kind of fascinated by the offsetting part. So what we can do here, I mean, given the specificity also of the work we do in Europe, is try to prevent public funding for going in the project, or trying to push on responsibilities of the different institutions for financing such a thing. And then it's always sensitive to see how you relate with the people there, because there is no, I mean, the context is very much different. In Madagascar, the community is kind of a community. They have their own way of organizing. At least we visited 1 out of 3 communities that are bordering the offsetting plant. So in Mongolia, it's completely different, because it's really family by family, and very little capacity on the spot. So not really a space for developing demands. So also there we are working on the company, on the institutions that are financing, and always keeping the channel of communication with the groups. So, and yeah, I mean, for international NGOs, I don't know how to say. I don't think there is a full recipe of what people can do. Also because, I mean, there is a variety of ways of acting and supporting and building solidarity campaigns. Our feeling is that it really should be like the way you decide what to do and how to do it should start from an open discussion with the groups that you are approaching. And first of all, you should ask yourself why you are approaching them. I mean, normally, either you are in touch for one reason or the other, but if you come out of the blue, the first thing is to kind of know each other and understand what is the political vision that each one has, and then understand whether there is a way of collaborating or not. But as I say, for me, putting ahead values like reciprocity and trying to establish an horizontal relationship are the key elements, and then everything else. I think it depends a lot on the case, on the groups, on many different things.
Yeah, with respect to the question about science, yeah, I agree completely, and I would even take it further. I mean, I think. Even people on the left have this tendency to think that, okay, well, on one side you have science, and on the other side you have capital and capitalism and economics. And, capitalism uses science, but science is sort of out there independently. And I think that's quite dangerous because, in a sense, a lot of the metrics and a lot of the classifications and a lot of the equations and whatnot that came from pre-capitalist science, basically, actually helped to constitute capitalism. So it's not like, capitalism came along and, science is extremely important, from the 11th and 12th century invention of abstract time onwards. I mean, this was sort of an era most people regard as pre-capitalist, yet, this is the precursor of the abstract time which capital used to develop. So, I would go even further than you were saying. The other point about science is that, it's contested and it has to be contested at many levels. I mean, it's contested at the level that Morgan talks about, where the ecologists are fighting among themselves, and also where the ecologists are fighting with the economists. But it's also contested at many other different levels. And I'd like to maybe pick up on Eric's point about being satisfied with, CO2 is fungible. Carbon is carbon, so it's fungible. So you can, scientific chemistry tells us, one carbon molecule in Madagascar is the same as a carbon molecule in Cambridge, and that is true. That is true chemically. Yet that science can be challenged politically as science simply by saying that the climate question is not about the admittedly true equations of chemistry. It's not about one carbon molecule being equal to another carbon molecule, even if that's true in scientific terms. And in fact, using that system of fungibility, that scientific system actually leads us in certain contexts in dangerous directions, and we should not talk about carbon molecules when we're talking about climate. Instead, we should talk about labor and labor exploitation. Climate is not a carbon problem. Climate is a labor problem. And this is something which is, still very difficult even for many on the left to get their heads around, that climate is not a carbon problem, it's a labor problem. It's not a problem of molecules. It's a problem of how thermodynamic energy has been developed since the 19th century in order to organize the unpaid work of nature. I mean, this is one of my favorite examples, and for some reason it's not talked about very much, is the way that thermodynamics, which is true, which is science, which gives us real, true equations, is a political thing which was used to organize the unpaid work of nature to make it more rentable, to make it more circulatable. And if you look at this history of thermodynamics, this is what it's about. It came out of the study of steam engines, how to make them better, how to make them more efficient. And so this is what the concept of energy itself is about, the concept that we use today. So you can say at one and the same time that, the equation, the first law of thermodynamics is true, but you can also say that this is not something we should regard as non-political, and it's not something that we should, assume when we're talking about something like the replacement of renewable energy, using renewable energy to replace fossil energy, as if that was the answer according to the first law of thermodynamics, because energy is energy. No, because energy is about labor and labor exploitation. We have to take a step back and critique what is a true science from the outside, and critique it politically, and regard that critique as also a scientific critique. So I would agree with you, but take it maybe one step further.
Do you have any reactions from Eric Morgan?
I could add something.
I was going to say the PES conference.
Okay. I would add that scientists play a role there, definitely, but and I think you gave this very broad perspective on this. But there's also a lot of mythology around how science is feeding this process. For instance, payments for ecosystem services, they are not based whatsoever on ecosystem service valuation whatsoever. Even there's no market component in these schemes. The World Bank and the C4 guys have defined payments for ecosystem services in a market-like way. And political ecologists very often, instead of going to the ground and see what's going on, have accepted a critically this framing to criticize it as a way of neoliberal conservation and markets and so on. Payments for ecosystem services, 95% of the funding for existing PS comes from public bodies. It's not a voluntary market. It's the funding are raised through taxes, and so it's like public bodies which are actually running these programs. Neoliberal, maybe in the way it's framed, but it's actually old school, traditional green rural subsidies. What we're looking at here. The level of payments, again, is not based on these sophisticated monetary valuations of environmental economies. They are based on opportunity costs. And they are very much shaped by political processes and political struggles. There are very good papers, for instance, on how local communities are not passive agents in this process. They also impose their own conditions and so on. And in the end, I believe this sort of level of payments are more determined by political than by scientific or market processes.
Just to carry on, I'm glad you said that. So I was hoping you would say it, because that's, you know, and the Mexican example is a perfect example of the kind of thing that the sort of market enthusiasts point to as a sort of, they'll either call it market-based, which it's clearly not, or they'll say it's a sort of a precursor to markets, as if, and they'll sort of say we're erecting this kind of Keynesian sort of set of payments to people. In hopes of what? That it will eventually kind of decompose and have to be replaced by market relationships? I mean, I don't know. It's really baffling that they're capable of referring to almost any kind of payment type arrangement as kind of a precursor to markets or market-led. So it's really important not to pay too much attention. And in fact, in the Mexican situation, and very much in the U.S. situation, where there are, we don't call them payments for ecosystem services, but it's, you know, agro-environmental payments, occupy the field that could otherwise be sort of a space where market environmentalism would flourish. And there's very strong competition in the US between farmers who can either participate in market strategies or just take a payment from the government. 9 times out of 10, they'll take a payment from the government because it's a sure thing. And the sort of market proponents feel very conflicted about this, and they kind of don't like it. So occupying that field is something that PES can really do very effectively.